Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tess Summer, and I'm with the Joseph Stern Center for Social Responsibility at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Justice in Action is a new conversation series between the JCC Social Justice Activist in Residence, Ruth Messenger, and New York City Council member, Brad Lander. Each week, we meet to discuss a different social justice issue and the way that it's being impacted and exacerbated by COVID-19. This week, we are lucky enough to be joined by Susan Lerner, Executive Director of Common Cause New York, and New York State Senator Zellnor Myrie to talk about voting rights and the upcoming election. So one quick note, if you have any questions that come up throughout the conversation, please feel free to send them to me at any point in time in the Q&A. If you put your mouse on the screen where you see my face speaking, you'll see the Q&A box below. And we really want to hear your questions and your thoughts as part of this community, so please don't be shy and send any questions that come up. And I'm going to hand it over to Ruth. Take it away.
Okay, I'm delighted to tell all of you who can't we can't see you, but we want you to know that there are a great many of you out there. We're really pleased with the interest that this series has developed. Tess will be posting regularly so you can look at old issues, look at the recordings, and find ways to take action. We've already had a long discussion about the impact of the virus, particularly on the jail and prison populations, and a discussion of the crisis in food banks, food delivery, particularly for poor people dependent on food pantries. Although I think there are also a lot of questions and concerns about other people getting food. And this is just a moment to do a shout out to all of the food providers, starting with the farm workers right up to the delivery people who are making it possible for many of us to stay safer at home. As you heard from Tess, this is about voting and voting rights. I've done a huge amount of work with Susan Lerner, the Executive Director of Common Cause New York, and was actively involved, as was the JCC, in the effort a few years ago, or a year and a half ago, whenever, to get some important legislative changes made in the state Senate, for which we thank you, Senator. And you will, the Senator is the chair of the committee, and I'm going to let Brad start off with the questioning and the issues, but just to tell you all that at the end of this session, we will have talked about lots of things you can do, and there will be a follow-up email telling you specifically who you can call, who you can lobby, who you can bother in order to make a difference. That's what this is all about. Brad.
Thanks, Ruth, and Zellnor and Susan, thank you so much for joining us today. As I was preparing my my Passover Haggadah for tonight, obviously, the family's doing a Zoom Seder, so we've got, on the plus side, we've got more people attending than often attend, because even people who couldn't have made it in person are coming by Zoom. Sort of the frame that I decided to use was suggested by this Arundhati Roy piece that some people have seen, where she describes the pandemic as a portal for seeing all these underlying weaknesses in our society, and just how they've both had a spotlight shined on them by the crisis, how the crisis has made them worse, often for some people, for folks who have been disenfranchised along lines of race or income or gender, and what they tell us about what we ought to do going forward, both in the moment of response and relief and recovery. How do we deal with this right now? And how do we pay attention to those deep underlying flaws as we move forward? Yes, Margie, I'll share the link to the article in just a minute after I finish the introduction. I like this about the chat. And so some of those things have been around inequalities, right, injustices. And so we focused, that first week on folks in jail or prison, who are, of course, much, disproportionately likely to be Black or Latino, and to have not had their rights honored before this. And then all the horror ways in which, obviously, you will have seen that just in the last week, the first fatality of somebody who was an inmate at Rikers who was there on a technical parole violation. Like like it should not be a death sentence, even if you were being held on suspicion of a serious crime, obviously. But the fact that the first person who died was there on a technical parole violation, and that, the State Office of Corrections and Governor Cuomo could have released hundreds of people that are there on technical parole violations. So a similar conversation we had about food and all the problems with our food security system that we weren't paying enough attention to before, that the crisis shines a spotlight on, makes dramatically worse, and compels us to do something about. This week, we're doing something a little bit different, because our election system is sort of not quite the same as an emergency response. And yet we've had it dramatically revealed just this week how the same thing is true, how weaknesses in the election system that undergirds our whole democracy, that yes, of course, have race, especially in Wisconsin, but race and class dimensions like voter suppression is built into our electoral system. We've been trying in New York, as you'll hear from these two great panelists who have helped lead the way in making some of those changes, but we still have a long way to go. And now here along comes a pandemic that hits across that system in a way we never would quite have thought about. Who would have thought about trying just to have an election under these conditions? So even if you had a solid democracy with good voting rights, you would have a problem figuring out how do we hold elections under pandemic conditions. And yet the challenge of responding to the crisis in a way that all of those previous problems have the spotlight shined so sharply on them, here we are. And we saw that, and I know Susan and Zellnor will talk a little more about what that meant yesterday in Wisconsin, but we especially want to think about what it means here in New York as well. So to help us
and nationally.
Yes, well, and I think, boy, if you were wondering, I guess I'll go one sentence more before I introduce here. I mean, if you are running, I guess we can get a little, I can get a little partisan on this chat. If your strategy for holding power is we need to keep winning even though only a minority of people support us, we don't have the majority of people don't support the agenda, then of course your strategy will be, how can we exploit an election system to make sure a minority of people can win the election? And obviously Republicans in Wisconsin, right on up to the president, have said as much. Expanding voter access hurts Republicans, so we'll have to shrink it down as much as we can. And then you'll be delighted if what happens is doubt is cast, illegitimacy is cast on the whole system. So that then if you say, well, that's illegitimate, they're like, great, you're right, the whole thing is illegitimate. And now you're really stuck in a very hard place. How do you fight back when the Supreme Court has been made a thing you can't trust to deliver the kinds of rights and protections our democracy is supposed to hold? So it is a very dark, set of issues. I will say we're lucky to have as our guests two people who have been great fighters on these issues and have made some progress. So this does not only need to be all about darkness, because as a result of the campaigning work of Common Cause that Susan has been leading for such a long time, and the Let New York Vote campaign, which ran over several years and continues to run to improve our elections, working in kind of a great inside-outside effort, and having as its inside champion New York State Senator Zellnor Myrie, who's just been one of the great new elected officials to burst onto the scene. He won his election against one of the Independent Democratic Conference, or IDC Democrats, on a platform of making the kinds of changes that these times call for. And he dove right in and got to be the chair of the Elections Committee. And some of the first legislation passed last year in that great session was what Susan and the coalition had worked on, that Zellnor led the way on the inside on. So we wanted to have them on to talk kind of both about the dark sides and the bright sides. What is wrong with this system and that it's being exposed, and what have you learned from your work together in making change that we need to know going forward. And we couldn't have two better guests. So I'm so delighted that you're both here. So we asked each of them to kind of just, give us a little opening, do some background, and then we'll get into some dialogue together.
Susan, you want to go first?
I was going to say, Zellnor, we'll let you go first.
Okay, I'll kick it off. Firstly, thank you to Brad and Ruth. I'm really excited to join both of you. Thank you for elevating these issues. It's just so critically important. As you said, Brad, this crisis has put a magnifying glass on many of the problems that existed prior to the pandemic. And it's important that we talk about it specifically and call those problems out because we're going to have to deal with this for a long time to come. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank all of our frontline workers. Just a huge thank you so much to the healthcare workers, to our essential workers, all of you who are continuing to allow this society to function. We cannot do it without you. And my second plug is my t-shirt here. Please make sure you fill out the census and make sure you're talking to as many people as possible to ensure that they fill it out as well. The city just announced, the Department of Health just announced some of the statistics, the demographic statistics of the COVID-19 related deaths. And we see that a third of those who have passed due to COVID are our Latinx friends and neighbors. 27% are Black, 27% are white, about 9% are Asian. And so, people of color are overrepresented in this. And when we talk about our democracy, we also see that the rates of participation are suppressed in that area as well. And so you add onto that a pandemic, it's going to do exactly what it has done for every other area, and it's going to highlight the gaps in our system and for those folks. And so before the pandemic, by way of Susan and many of the advocates who have fought so long for this, we had been trying to fight these issues. And so we wanted to increase participation by way of early voting, consolidation, a number of issues. We introduced the New York Voting Rights Act at the beginning of this session to see how we could be more proactive in protecting folks. And then we get hit with a once in a century pandemic that forces us to do things on the fly and to adjust our elections. And so we have already taken some steps, the legislature and the governor has, to deal with this. As you know, we were supposed to have a presidential primary in a couple of weeks. That got moved and postponed to June. We had to stop our petitioning process earlier because we didn't want to further expose folks to COVID. We put in some provisions in the budget that would allow for candidates to remove themselves from the ballot in the presidential primary in order to lower the turnout. And we still have a lot more to go. I think Susan is going to go into a number of the questions around our absentee ballots, making voting more accessible remotely. But I just want to say that our Board of Elections employees, they have been essential workers in this, and they have continued to work even though this is a perilous time. And the notion that our democracy must continue even in these times is something that is not lost on a lot of us. But we have to figure out how to do that in a way that still protects our public health and still protects our workers. And so, just in New York City alone, the Board of Elections has about 900 employees. Right now, that workforce is reduced by almost a tenth. They're in the 70 to 80 range. And that is both due to the kind of stay-at-home orders coming in from our executives, but they're also a workforce that is disproportionately older. And that's not just in New York City, that is throughout the state. And they have folks that are more vulnerable. And so when we think about the changes that we want to make to increase people's opportunity to participate in their democracy, I hope that we continue to keep in mind our Board of Elections workers that are still on the front line. So thank you again. We look forward to answering questions. And Susan, I will kick it to you now.
Thanks so much, Zellnor, and thanks so much for all of the significant advocacy you've done for reform in the state Senate. it is really exciting to those of us who are voting rights advocates to have such a strong partner internally who really wants to improve our elections. And Brad and Ruth, thank you so much for this forum and this opportunity to talk about, the baseline, the real lifeblood of our democracy and how it's supposed to function, and the really upsetting fault lines that we're seeing right now. We at Common Cause is a national organization. We have chapters all across the country. We've got paid states in close to 25 different states, paid staff in close to 25 different states. And I've been on national phone calls hearing about how all of the different states are struggling with the situation. So many of the states did what happily Governor Cuomo has done at the request of so many of us, which was push back the April primary and merge it with our June 23rd primary. So we have only one primary. But as you pointed out, Brad, there are fault lines and weaknesses in our system here in New York. For too many years.
Susan,
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for 1 minute? When you go on, can you just be sure you remind people what it was a year and a half ago, and what organizers and action led by Common Cause, supported by Zellnor, led by the State Senate, what changes we actually produced?
Yes.
So that we remind people that this kind of organizing and activism works.
Absolutely does. And, the Let New York Vote Coalition, which we helped to found and to lead, really, I think, brought a broad selection of organizations and grassroots activists across the state together to focus on the fact that New York's election laws were appallingly outdated. And so exciting to see such a significant package passed at the beginning of 2019, which brought us early voting, which brought us pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, which brought us registration portability, and really important when we're going to be talking about the vote by mail idea and expanding absentee, the first passage of the necessary constitutional resolution to amend our Constitution so you no longer have to swear under penalty of perjury that you are entitled to an absentee ballot because of a very limited set of reasons. And again, the first pass for a constitutional amendment that would allow us to have same-day registration, which is a significant factor that helps to increase voter turnout. So we're on the path to those things, but we have early voting. We are able to pre-register 16 and 17-year-olds. The package at the beginning of this year also significantly improved early voting that the Senate passed, and the passage for automatic voter registration. So we are on the way to catching up with most of the rest of the country that have adopted some really important reforms that are designed to make voting more accessible to every eligible voter, and to remove barriers to registration, to remove disincentives to actually participate, and be able to have a voice in deciding what is going to happen with our country, who is going to lead us, and who is going to be responsive to our concerns. So these are all extremely important reforms which we've gotten. But right now, as I said, and as Brad pointed out, there are some very real fault lines. Zellnor talked about our Board of Election employees. Now, I've not always been the biggest fan of the Board of Elections, as I think people know, that I've had a lot to say in criticizing them. But right now, the workers are being unfairly tasked with what is frankly not a democratic aspect of our system. And that is the petty fights that go on between different candidates trying to knock other opponents off the ballot. That's what our election workers are sitting and doing right now. 2 of them have died in Brooklyn. 10 of them are sick in Manhattan for the anti-democratic process of trying to keep people from being on the ballot, to try and restrict choices that the voters have. And that's really a problem. But we're going to have to leave that, that is something which should be addressed immediately. Those people should not be at risk for election law gamesmanship. And, we see in Wisconsin what happens if our elected officials and authorities don't pay attention to elections in time enough to make the changes that really address this highly unusual situation. We ran elections right after Superstorm Sandy. We ran elections, and in fact, 9/11 was an election day. That election got postponed for 1 week. We managed to run elections then, but we didn't have the obstacle that we have now, which is that people cannot gather. And in-person elections, the voting day is an inherently social occasion. And unfortunately, we in New York City are all too aware of what the lines can be like and how crowded our polling places can be, particularly on presidential election years, which we are in right now. So there's a lot of concern that we should not be in the situation that we appallingly saw in Wisconsin yesterday. If any of you saw the social media or the news reports, people stood online in the rain and hail for 5 hours in some places in Milwaukee, where they went down from over 150 polling places to 5 voting centers, and where the absentee ballot distribution was really problematic. And so many people who asked for absentee ballots never received them, and they were forced to decide, should I risk my health? Should I risk making somebody else sick and be disenfranchised, or should I brave this situation? And voting is so important that I am going to risk my health. We saw lines, people weren't distancing, many people didn't have masks, and there was no reason why that situation had to happen that way. And most appallingly to me was the photo I saw, and we are nonpartisan, but we have to call it, nonpartisan is not neutral. We have to call it as we see it. And that is the Republican speaker of the Wisconsin, I forget whether it was the Senate or the Assembly, who worked the polls, was fully masked, fully gloved, and had on the equivalent of a hazmat suit, and was standing there and telling people, this is safe, come out and vote, because he personally had blocked all efforts to continue the primary, which happily we've done, and to make absentee balloting more accessible. So here in New York, we can take a lesson from Wisconsin and address the changes that we need, and address them now, not in June, because the election workers, the boards of elections need time to prepare. So we're advocating for making absentee ballots much more accessible, either through a statute or executive order. Define illness broadly. The governor did this in relation to the Queen's BP special election that then got postponed. Fear of getting sick, fear of making somebody sick can be defined as illness under our Constitution, and in our current situation, it should be. Senator Biaggi has a bill which would do that, or the governor could do it by executive order. Senator Myrie has a bill which would allow all of us to apply for absentee ballots through email. Right now, you have to get an application on paper, either download it from the BOE, fill it out, and either fax it back or mail it back. Well, that's crazy. Right now, we're moving away from paper. We don't want more pieces of paper that people have to handle, that employees then have to open and process. We should be able to do this electronically. And then there are specific protections which can take place at polling places, because even states that are considered all vote by mail, like Washington State, it's actually not the case that everybody votes by mail. A lot of people still need to come in and vote in person. There are language access issues. There are people who physically need assistance, need a ballot marking device or some assistance to vote. And hey, there are the people who signed up to get a mail ballot, but it just didn't arrive, like the case for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of voters in Wisconsin. So we're going to need in-person voting. And to do that properly, we've got early voting in place, which is a great emergency measure. Early voting helps distribute voters away from just election day over a 9-day period to allow them to distance, to allow them to pick a time that's convenient for them when there aren't going to be many other people voting. And it's a great emergency response. So we need to expand absentee balloting. We need to expand and protect our early voting period. And we need to take precautions on election day. And finally, I'd like to say that we have, unfortunately, hundreds of thousands of people who are out of work. And we need to find a way to help the boards of elections and the political parties who choose poll workers to tap into the unemployment rolls, where we have many, many talented people who are used to dealing with the public because they're restaurant managers or bartenders or retail workers who could be employed as poll workers. And we would have a much younger workforce, and maybe we would have a whole new set of people who will then become poll workers for the decades ahead. There's a lot to be done, but it can be done now, and we have a clear outline. If you're interested in the full scope of our recommendations from Common Cause New York, you can go to our website, commoncause.org, click on New York, and right on the front page, we'll take you to the page where we have our recommendations. We've issued a detailed white paper about the reforms that we believe need to be in place now. So we want to support Senator Myrie in helping the legislature pass the necessary authorizations, and also be sure that what the governor needs to do, he does sooner rather than later.
I think that's fantastic. Zellnor, just maybe you could tell people when you're moving some of this legislation, what do you hear from the opponents? I mean, I was struck both by the Wisconsin argument, where clearly was totally a partisan effort. Like, you know, we'll do better if fewer people vote. We'll do better if more people vote. But I was also, you know, the president actually said yesterday, talking about federal legislation, yes, if we make it too easy for people to vote, Republicans will never get elected. So that you can't, you know, that's a partisan comment, but that's what he said. And I'm just wondering, when we had the sort of wave of reforms that I referenced and that Susan described and that you referenced, or when some of these issues that Susan just talked about that are going to be pending in the state, what do the people say who say that they want to vote, that they're going to vote against them?
Yeah, Ruth, thank you so much for that. You know, just speaking to the first thing you mentioned, what's so unfortunate about the clear partisan attacks on good voting reforms is that they undercut what are at times legitimate criticisms, right? And so, or legitimate concerns. And so when we talk about, you know, an all-male system, there are some folks who are legitimately concerned about what security risks that might pose for people's ballot, right? And it's a couple of steps removed for you to apply for it, to get the ballot and to send it back. It's not as straightforward as you walking in to a poll site. And so there's concerns about that. But that is completely wiped away by them making overtly partisan remarks saying that we are going to lose our power. If we do things the right way, we will lose. And that's what it all boils down to. And so my first, you know, I had the honor of introducing the early voting bill. It was the first bill that the Senate took up. It was the first debate that we had, and it was my first day on the job. And so that was
and he did a great job.
Thank you. And so I remember in that back and forth, the you know, folks on the other side of this, they had no real concern about whether or not this would open up our democracy and make things easier for folks to participate. You know, I got questions like, Senator, have you ever gone door knocking in the North Country? Do you know how difficult it is to do things under those circumstances? And I'm like, I don't see, you know, respectfully, I don't see how that is relevant to us doing what 37 other states in this country do and have done in all sorts of climates. And so I think there's always an ostensible reason and an ostensible argument. They say it will cost too much, for instance, for us to do these reforms, we need money for our local boards of elections. And my response to that is, well, we will deal with that in the budget, but what does our democracy cost? How much are you willing to pay to have the franchise? And they never really have a response to that because that's not the real argument. The undergirding argument is that this is going to be bad business for them. And so as it pertains to mail-in voting and absentee voting, I suspect we're going to hear some of those same arguments. This is going to be too costly. It is going to be costly, and we should invest in it because that is, one, the price of our democracy, and two, the price of keeping the public safe. We will hear that it's going to be too onerous on the local boards, and we need to provide support. I think Susan can speak to what many thought was going to be federal support, but what turned out not to be so much. And so I think we're going to hear the same arguments, but we got to fight back and say this is worth our public health and our democracy.
Susan, Zellnor may know this also, and Brad, you may have questions, but Susan, I'm curious to know where we've ended up in Florida. I know we're talking about New York, but there was a lot of activity, some of it based out of the JCC before the 2018 election, to organize phone calls into Florida, urging people to vote for the legislation that would allow rehabilitated citizens to regain their voting status. And I actually was with people making some of those calls, and they were very powerful. And then I know that after it passed, Florida basically tried to institute what I would call a poll tax by checking on all people's credit and loan history when they showed up to register. And if you owed any fine or fee to the state government, then you were told you couldn't register. But I wonder where that's gotten to now.
So what happened, not surprisingly, what we see all too frequently in citizen-led initiatives to bring about really significant reform and a big leap is an attempt by legislatures to nullify the vote, and that's what they tried to do in Florida. What happened was that as you pointed out, people were being held accountable for huge numbers of fines and prevented from registering unless they cleared up thousands of dollars. Not surprisingly, lawsuits were filed. They've been successful at the district level, but it's still going through the courts. And so there are a significant number of people who cannot register until this issue is resolved, and we hope productively and positively through the courts. But as Brad points out, we can no longer rely on the US Supreme Court to do the right thing. Nevertheless, there's somewhere between 300 and 500,000 people who are still entitled to vote, even with this suppression poll tax idea, who didn't have fines. Between 300 and 500,000 Floridians whose right to vote has been restored. That is still a huge, huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
Even with the, perhaps 600,000 people who are facing this onerous poll tax type suppression. The passage of that measure has and will continue to make a really significant difference in Florida, with hundreds of thousands of people being re-enfranchised and empowered to have their voices heard. So all of the work that everybody did, and I know how hard the JCC worked and was behind it, and so many people calling and people going down to Florida to help this pass, that work has accomplished something really significant. Even if it's not as large a number as we had hoped, it's still a really big number.
I have a question, and I think this is both a New York State question, but also a federal one. And it's about what's possible in moving to more universal vote by mail. I know that in New York State, part of the challenge is that a constitutional amendment is necessary and has a more complex multi-year voting requirement. But I saw yesterday that Elizabeth Warren has made a proposal for national, making it possible nationally to vote by mail. So I guess to the extent Susan, maybe on the federal question, would it even be possible? Leaving aside that the Republicans in the Senate would never do it, and would it be possible to have a federal policy that would be vote by mail for all Americans, And then assuming it either isn't possible or just isn't going to happen because the Senate wouldn't do it, is that still something that we're working on, and sort of what are the next steps toward it, which wouldn't be ready by November, but
Right.
you know, still seem very
So there's a bill that was introduced by Senators Wyden and Klobuchar, which would be a universal vote by mail requirement. If you read all of Elizabeth Warren's recommendations, her entire program, she acknowledges in her program that not all states are going to be able to go to a all vote by mail system very quickly, which is, unfortunately the case here. And that's what our white paper is about, vote by mail versus absentee balloting and what's possible here. Vote by mail, there's an amazing letter that the election official of the state of Washington circulated. I have no idea the time, 2 weeks, 3 weeks ago, time is a blur, where she basically cautioned, she sent it to every election official at every state and said, everybody's talking about vote by mail, and vote by mail is great. It works really well for us in Washington. But what you don't seem to realize is it took us over 10 years to set it up and get it right. It didn't happen overnight. There's a huge amount of infrastructure. So we have 13 states, I believe the number is, and if I'm wrong, forgive me, but it's around that number, that have the similar restrictions to the ones we do. But the other states are what we call no-fault absentee. And they have a much better experience with large numbers of people voting on an absentee basis. They're closer to being able to go to an all vote by mail system with the significant infrastructure that it requires. If we required that the Board of Elections either had to mail an application for an absentee ballot or mail a ballot to every single voter in our state, we're talking about 12 million pieces of mail in a state where up until now, the number of people who vote absentee is under 4%, generally speaking. So the boards just they're not used to that kind of volume. And remember, we have what, Zellnor, I think it's 2,000 people per ED. That means every 2,000 voters, you have a different ballot. This isn't like printing, 12 million direct mail catalogs, all of which are identical, and slapping labels on them. This is figuring out which voter gets which ballot. So in Washington state, the election official pointed out that for a county that has about 500,000 people, the election authority there employs 500 temporary workers for the month before the ballots get mailed out to match the ballot to the voter, stuff the envelopes, and get it in the mail. So in Los Angeles, where they're now being required to go to vote by mail because of the emergency, interestingly enough, in California, approximately 65% of voters in California are permanent absentee and are already voting by mail. In Los Angeles, it's 40%. And I think that is because of the very different community in Los Angeles that's closer to our community. You have many community members who are very aware of voter suppression, and they want to see their ballot cast in front of them so that they know that it hasn't gone astray because of a history of voter suppression. So in LA, now required to go to all absentee, all vote by mail, the register recorder there said he is going to need to find 2 entire warehouses, gigantic warehouses, to be able to print and store and stuff and mail and get the ballots back. This is a huge operation, which ultimately down the line, 10 years, 15 years, maybe 5, if we were lucky, I think our state will undertake, but it's not going to happen between now and November. So what can we do to help the boards? Where a reasonable estimate would be, we would ask them to go from 4% absentee to 25 to 30% absentee. And that would be a huge jump but it would help a lot. And we're going to need to change the law fast, and we're going to need to figure out how to get the money from the feds that was promised to be without strings, that's now coming down with a 20% match, which is absolutely outrageous at a time when there, as Zellnor knows, there's no money, as the governor keeps saying over and over again. There's no income for many of us, which means no income for the state, and huge demands, emergency funding that's needed on so many things. So to have a demand that the state has to pony up $4.4 million in order to access the $22 million that it's been promised in the CARE Act is outrageous. And one thing that people listening today can do is you can let Senator Schumer know that he should fix this error, because voting rights advocates were promised this was money without strings. So make it money without strings. We need that 22 million. We need it now. The boards, the county boards are starved for funding in the best of times, and now they're on the ropes. Get us the federal money, Senator Schumer, without strings. And in the next stimulus bill, we need there to be a much larger allocation for election costs. The Brennan Center estimates we need $2 billion nationally. The CARE Act provides $400 million, and we're glad to see some down payment, but we need the rest of those funds, and we need it to come fast and without strings. So let Senator Schumer know by email, by a comment on his website, if you are so inclined to call him, that he should fix this error and get us our election money now.
That's fantastic. That's really helpful. I wonder if each of you would say something. We're talking about expanding voting by mail, getting rid of the ridiculous constraints. And as I said, I think it was really eloquent, Susan, saying that it will take time, it will take staff, but it's a direction. But a lot of people that I talk to about voting by mail conflate voting by mail with electronic voting.
Yeah.
And they are, I mean, I think it's a good thing to say that they are, wait a minute, I don't want voting by mail because then somebody could hack the computer and steal the election, which when people first started talking about voting by mail, literally, I can tell you when this was, early in one of my election races, so like 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago, I remember somebody that two people that I still work with very closely, but Annie Hess producing the earliest articles against computerized voting and hacking. And I want to say that then I thought, like, you know, why are these articles being written about this brand new system of using computers and it might work and it would get everybody to be able to vote? And she's sending all these cautions against it. And now in 2020, it seems like, you know, Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump have figured out like a great deal of this. In bad ways, for bad reasons.
Paper ballots.
So this is all paper ballots. You would get something in the mail, you would complete your ballot, and you would have some options of sending it back or delivering it someplace, right?
Right, that's the way in which it should work. The delivery part of it's a little tough right now. In Colorado, in Washington state, they have special receptacles, which frankly are embedded in the sidewalk and have security cameras focused on them at all times.
Wow.
And they're heavy steel things that you can't reach into because you have to protect the ballots. And we understand, as more states that are capable of going to vote by mail are actually transitioning to vote by mail on an emergency basis, you can't buy one of these special receptacles, one of these drop boxes for love or money.
Brad, do you have some questions? Tess, are there some questions coming in? Senator, you were about to speak.
We have a question in the Q&A box that I think might be good for Senator Myrie about early voting and about the challenge of getting venues for it. You know, schools, you know, I think there was, you know, we can't use a school in the same way to close them down for a month. So what do you think is the best way to solve that issue?
Yeah, so, and if I could just briefly address some of what Susan said, I just want to underscore the fact that this is a major undertaking, asking the Board of Elections to increase their ability to issue absentee ballots. Susan went into some of the technicalities. If you think about just one election district for our June, or at least now scheduled June elections, you have county committee races, you have congressional races, every state legislator is up for re-election, and all of those are different by each election district. County committee members are running in each ED, and so the ability, we have ballot printers now that can do it on site. That's what was part of our early voting package. And so that does allow for us to quickly print up someone's ballot on site. But to do that in a pre-packaged way and to then send that out to everyone, both to active and inactive registrants, is not a simple thing to do. And so I think it is right for us to really kind of measure our expectations, but to really push to do it, to have as many as possible. Now, to the early voting piece, Susan mentioned this earlier at the top of our legislative session. One of the bills that we passed, in addition to automatic voter registration, was we said that you cannot use schools for early voting. And why that was, we had a lot of interesting feedback. In fact, Susan and I, at a press conference to announce early voting, to gin up support, to say this is something everyone should be excited about. We're going to do it in schools. We stood up in front of a high school, and we had a news camera there. And the principal of the school walks out and says, "What are you doing here?" And we were like, "Well, this is an early voting site, and we're just trying to let people know that this is super exciting." And she said, "This is the first time I'm hearing about this." And we should have known. Yeah, it was bad. It wasn't good. It wasn't good. And so we should have known from then that we were going to have a lot of difficulties around schools being used for early voting sites. Now, this has no impact on elections for the primary, for the actual election day, for primary and general election. Schools are used to doing that. They've been doing that for many, many years. But the early voting presented a lot of problems. And so we wanted to help them out in that way. Regarding other sites, it is my opinion, and I think of many of my colleagues, that if you are a recipient of tax dollars, you should be open to being an early voting site. The truth is that we have a lot of institutions that had the capability to do this. And we saw this throughout the city. There were museums, libraries, there were all sorts of unusual polling sites that did it and did it pretty seamlessly. And so I think we're going to continue to push the envelope on that to see if we can get more participants. A lot of our higher education institutions have the capability to do this as well. They just need enough lead time to do it because they have to adjust their schedules. And so I think that we are, it's still an ongoing conversation about the number of sites that we can use. But we know, at least in from the high school downward, schools aren't going to be used, hopefully, going forward.
But Zellnor, how do you feel about using schools this June when schools have been out of session for months and months, and there aren't any kids, and it might actually be easier for the boards of elections to set up early voting in schools that are no longer in session? Is that something that we should be considering?
Yeah. I think that is certainly something that we should consider. The pushback against having early voting days in school sites was the impact on the children, having them to, the people couldn't use the cafeteria, interrupting instruction, the security issues with people walking in and out of the building during a school day. And so if you remove the students from that equation, I think that helps to allay a lot of the concerns.
Brad, do you have a question or two, or some follow-up you want from people?
Sure, there's one little follow-up from Ellen, and then I have another question. She asked, you mentioned that, well, I'll say first, my early voting site was the Park Slope Armory, and it was so lovely. Like the staff, probably I think the staff were excited, but it almost felt like a little festival of democracy there. And for me, it was especially poignant because, Susan, you mentioned the election after Hurricane Sandy. At that time, we had 500 frail elderly living on the drill floor of the Park Slope Armory. They were evacuated from nursing and adult homes in southern Brooklyn and the Rockaways, and volunteers walked up and down the aisle and collected affidavits from hundreds of those 500 folks and went down to the board and got their affidavit ballots. And it was really like just a very beautiful.
Yeah, we had a huge effort to let people know, and we sent workers into the all of the evacuation shelters.
Yeah, I mean, that was the difference of being able to be in person together, which, you know, for all the ways that we would be better if we could do mailing, and as much as I thought that, you know, Joe Biden came off just a little bit tinny yesterday saying everyone should go to the polls, I know what he means. You know, you want to be at the polls. It's beautiful. It's like doing democracy together. Ellen's question, it relates to the printing of ballots. And Zellnor, you mentioned that they could be like your own ballot could be printed for you at the early voting site. She asks whether that could be done as part of a vote by mail system. Could you get your ballot like PDF'd to you, you know, so that it would be easier to customize, and then I guess you'd print it out. You'd have to have a printer and mail it back, or this kind of gets to some of the challenges that both of you spoke about doing this.
Yeah, you know, I think, and I know Susan wants to jump in here as well. There are many of us who are very comfortable with the advances that we've made in technology. We are kind of secondhand with all of this conference in itself, this phone call, Zoom conference, is an indication of that. But when thinking about voting writ large, we have to consider that there are that there's a digital divide where many folks do not have the capability to access some of that. And two, that even if they did, they may not be comfortable. And that they're also, to Ruth's point earlier, there's some security concerns around some of these things, right? You know, so for instance, my bill would just allow for the application to be done by email, right? As the law stands now, it's very antiquated that it requires what we call in the business a wet signature in order for you to get it, and you know, you have to fax. So there's still some sanctity around having a uniform, everyone gets the same sort of process to get their ballot. But I don't know if Susan has different thoughts on that.
So, you know, the challenge is there are a few places which will, you know, some states or some counties in those states which will send you out a form, a ballot to fill out, which you then have to print out, fill out, sign, and mail back. And as Zellnor points out, the digital divide is significant. Not everybody has internet access, but I've really been surprised at the number of people that I work with who don't have printers at home.
Yeah.
Right?
What do you need a printer for anymore?
I have the Office, right? That is a high-speed color printer, right? Now, I'm assuming not a lot of people are printing a lot of personal material on the Office computer. We'll leave that aside. But it just goes to show that and I find it's more of an age thing. My younger staff, they don't bother with printers. It's just not important to them. The other thing that happens in those states is that the ballot that we fill out, either as an absentee ballot or at the polling place, is a specific form that's read by the scanner. If you print it out at home and mail it back in, it tends not to be scannable. So that means somebody takes your ballot and copies it over onto the scannable ballot and puts it in the stack so nobody knows how you voted, whatever. There are various controls. But that's another human step that people don't realize has to happen, so that it requires more infrastructure and more people to handle pieces of paper that then get thrown away. And they should be shredded, frankly, so that nobody knows what your vote is. So it's attractive whenever we talk about voting on the internet or on your phone or getting your ballot electronically. It all sounds very attractive, but the details of it really are troublesome, and it's just not as easy as people think.
So
I
there's
have,
lots to do.
I have one more question that I feel bad squeezing in at the end of the hour, and I might even get like Zellnor in some trouble on it, but I can't resist asking because a lot of the challenges of operationalizing any of this are the New York City Board of Elections, which is the most cockamamie structured thing that there is. You got these 10 commissioners, one from each party from each of the 5 boroughs. Getting a majority of 6 is almost impossible. The authority of the executive director is unclear. Obviously, we can't go into details, but any chance that this moment could be a moment where we could actually look at the structure of the Board of Elections itself and come to something that might be better able to run our elections?
Senator, before you answer, I'm going to let Brad get you in trouble. I think that's fine. But as all of you know who are listening to this program know, Seder starts tonight. But if you have a granddaughter in London, Seder starts in 2 minutes. So I am going to my family Zoom Seder right now between London and New York. And I wish those of you who celebrate a happy Passover. But really, I just want to say on my own behalf, Brad will say it again, thanks Susan and Zellnor, and just ask you, we have a willing audience now. And so whatever next step actions you want us to have people take, they're raring to go. So
Great.
Thank you very, very much.
Aziz Pesach.
Thank you. And Brad, I'll talk to you in Tess later
Chag
on.
Sameach, Ruth.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.
Okay.
So I know Susan has very strong thoughts on this. I'm going to be a bit more scaled back and diplomatic and say that I think that we, I've expressed this publicly before, that I think we should be taking a hard look at the structure of the Board of Elections. I think that there are certain aspects that we can do to professionalize the process, not the least of which is paying our poll workers more. But I think that we have a number of things for us to look at. I on the state level and on the local level, I think the kind of equal partisan divide was instituted in good spirit and in response to a lot of corruption, and was meant to kind of remove partisanship from the process. And what we have seen over time is that it has, in many instances, increased that partisanship, not just here in the city, but in other parts of the state. We saw that most recently with early voting, where there were Republican commissioners who did not want to place early voting sites in places that would be advantageous, or what they deemed to be advantageous to the Democrats. And because of that, that logjam created a delay in polling sites, and in some instances, the disenfranchisement of vulnerable communities. And so I think that is a discussion that we should continue to have. And that's my non-getting in trouble answer.
That was great. That was great. Let me just, as we close out, because we're past the hour now, but I do want to give you a chance to just pitch people if there's, one thing you'd like to ask them to do. We'll follow up and send it out to everyone who registered for the call. But it'd be great to know, is there one thing people should do if they're inspired by what you're talking about and want to commit to help make it better?
So for me, it is contact Senator Schumer by phone, by email, through his website, and tell him to get us the federal election money without any strings, no matching funds, and be sure there's election money in the next stimulus package.
I agree with Susan in that the truth is that the state, we were really, and this was a really bad budget, but it would have been many times worse if not for the federal assistance that we got. And so I think we, all indications are that won't be the last package of assistance. And so for this particular issue, I think it's important for us to communicate to our federal reps who have been receptive to our concerns, to say this is what needs to happen. I think remaining vigilant on what we're doing on the state level. I know that there have been many calls, as Susan has been one of the leaders on the legislature going back to work. I will say, as a legislator, that there was no indication for me or many of my colleagues that we didn't plan to do so. And I hope that we will get back in earnest to tackle a number of the things that we spoke about today.
Thank you,
That was
guys.
great. thank you guys both so much for being here and giving the time today. And I just will add my voice of what Ruth said, of wishing everyone, as this in Pesach, this is going to be obviously a very different Passover for a lot of us this year. But I know people are finding ways to be creative and share love and ideas, and that vision of liberation, can still ring through loud and clear, even if it has to be on Zoom.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Susan, Zellnor, Brad. We are so appreciative of you guys coming on here and sharing all this information. Just to let everyone know, I'll send you an email with some follow-up actions and some information for you guys. And our next session will be next Friday after Passover, and it will be about domestic violence. So you'll be getting a lot of emails from me. I wish you all a happy Passover, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Stay safe.